For the next section of Lesson 8.2 Day 3, we're going to simplify and then identify any x values for which the expression is undefined. So with number 3, before I even factor, I am going to rewrite the numerator in standard form. So I'm going to put my negative 2x in front and then plus 10. So it's the same thing, just in standard form. I just want to know that I need to factor out that negative since it's in front. So if I factor out a negative 2 on the top, we would have negative 2 times x minus 5. Then in the denominator, I can factor out x. So that's x times x minus 5. Now before I simplify, I'm going to make sure I identify my excluded values. So that's where we go off to the side and set the denominator equal to 0. And remember that the zero product property allows us to take both parts of this equation. So I'm talking about the x and the x minus 5 and set each of those equal to 0 and solve. So first we have x equals 0, so that tells us right away that that's one of our excluded values. Then we can add 5 to both sides with the second equation. So that tells us that x cannot equal 5. So we have 2 excluded values for this problem. Next, we can go back to our problem and continue to simplify. So we have x minus 5 in the numerator and the denominator, so those would cancel out. So that leaves us with just negative 2 over x. Okay, for the last section of this lesson, we're going to multiply or divide and assume that all expressions are defined. So that means we do not need to say what x cannot equal. So starting with number 4, we have x plus 1 over 3x plus 6 times 6x plus 12 over x squared minus 1. So let's factor everything that we can. In the denominator of our first fraction, we can factor out a 3. So that gives us 3 times x plus 2. Then in our second fraction, in the numerator, we can factor out a 6. So that gives us 6 times x plus 2. And in the denominator of the second fraction, we have a difference of perfect squares, x squared minus 1. So we take the square root of the first term, the square root of the last term, and we have 1 plus, 1 minus. Now we can simplify. We can cancel out x plus 1 and x plus 1, x plus 2 and x plus 2. Then we can also reduce. We have 6 divided by 3, so that would be a 2 and a 1. So on the numerator, we are left with 2. In the denominator, we have 1 times x minus 1, which is just x minus 1. So our final answer is 2 over x minus 1. Next, let's take a look at number 5, where we need to divide. So we are going to start by rewriting our problem as multiplication by the reciprocal. So our first fraction stays the same. We switch division to multiplication, and we flip our second fraction. Okay, now that we have done that, we can solve it just like problem number 4, where we factor and simplify. So let's factor the first fraction. We can factor the numerator into 2 binomials. The factors of 3 are 3 and 1, and we want it to add up to a positive 4, so these would both be positive. In the denominator, we have a difference of perfect squares. So we take the square root of the first term, the square root of the last term, and we have 1 plus, 1 minus. Now for our second fraction, let's factor the numerator. We have x and x. The factors of 8 are 1 and 8, or 2 and 4. So we would want to use 2 and 4 because we're trying to get them to add up to a -6. And in order to add up to -6, these would both need to be negative. Now the denominator of our second fraction, we can factor that into two binomials. The factors of 3 are 1 and 3, and we want them to add up to a +2, so we would say -1, +3. Now we can start to simplify. So it looks like we've got x plus 3 and x plus 3, x minus 2 and x minus 2, and that is it. So on top we are left with x plus 1 times x minus 4. On the bottom we have x plus 2 times x minus 1. Now remember, you do not need to distribute this out. You can, that wouldn't be incorrect, but you just don't need to take that extra step of work. So this would be your final